sign in. So with that, over to you.
Good afternoon, everybody. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Andrea Nocentini. I'm going to give a quick background. Dr. Nocentini has an education in forestry, agriculture, and natural resource management. During his PhD at the University of Bologna, he researched for 4 years carbon fluxes due to land use changes to perennial bioenergy crops. After, he worked at FIU and with the National Park Service to carrying out scientific research in the Everglades freshwater wetlands, where he researched the biogeochemical and vegetation community dynamics as driven by the interaction of hydrological and fire management. In the last 2 years, Dr. Nocentini has monitored and analyzed water quality in wetlands, lakes, ponds, and ditches and canals of the Seminole Tribe of Florida reservations. Please help me welcome Dr. Nocentini.
Well, good afternoon, and thank you very much for inviting me to give this seminar, and thank you to the students that welcomed me so nicely today and took me to lunch. So that was really nice. And so when I was asked to give this seminar like a few weeks ago, I started thinking, as I was going to give a seminar about my work as a scientist at this point for the last 10 years. And I was thinking, what is that defines me? What is that defines my body of work? And so I started looking back and what I realized is that actually my professional career has been really evolving at the rhythm of my personal life. And so I'm going to give a brief overview of my connection to natural system and ecosystems, throughout my life, briefly. So this is where I grew up in central Italy, Tuscany, and basically my family, they've always owned some land, produced with olive groves and produced olive oil. They still do. So I've always had that type of connection with agriculture since I was a kid. Also, both my grandfather my father still is a mushroom picker. And so they've always taken me to beech forest and silverfir forest just for hiking or picking mushrooms. And so I've always had that type of connection, and I'm glad that I had it. Also, these forests are really the ones that I studied during my bachelor degree, University of Firenze. After I moved to North Italy, specifically in the Po Valley, which is like one of the most fertile districts in Europe, and basically there I did my master and my PhD. And you can see an aerial picture of the experimental farm of the University of Bologna, where I conducted some of my work. And then in the same time period, I met the person that's now my wife, and she was a Florida resident, and she still is, and we both are now. And so that's the reason why I moved to Florida, and I encountered this type of ecosystems. And so I started, enjoying and also working in Everglades marshes, cypress, in big cypress. You can see a beautiful picture of a cypress dome. I actually took when I was with John, and it's low. And anyway, so I've been working in these environments for the last 6 years, and I had like great mentoring, really. So I'm really thankful all the people that taught me along. And anyway, so as you can see, my professional career has gone through like really different systems, and so. When I was thinking of a title for my speech, what I realized is that I ended up landing on this holistic, because I feel that that's in general my approach when I do science. I just tend to look at ecosystems more as a whole. I like to work on ecosystem budgets, or I like to look at how multiple factors interact, driving certain ecosystem dynamics. And obviously, holistic doesn't mean that I'm taking everything into account. You always have to set boundaries of your analysis and of your workflow. And these boundaries are given by really feasibility and data availability. And anyway, and what I recognized that really like this way of doing science is really a reflection of my personality. You know, if you ask my wife, she would tell you that I have obsessive compulsive disorder. And so I think like, and you know, I'm joking about it, but it's true, she says it, correct? And so like, you know, being able to account for multiple factors when I look at a system, it comes, I guess it gives me like a sense of order. And so it's kind of a reflection of who I am. And another thing that I've thought about it often, or at least recently, is, for example, if I'm riding in a car with someone and the person would tell me, hey, did you see the sign that says that we're 30 miles away from the town where we're going? I say, no, I didn't see that, but the landscape is beautiful outside. So, you know, obviously I'm joking, but it's the truth about me. So I tend to see things more as a whole, and I don't really focus on details as small processes. And so the way I do science, I guess, is just a reflection of my personality. And so I was just trying to excuse the title of my seminar and what I do. And so going into some of the science that I've worked, that I've done, I know that some of you are interested in agroecology and agriculture, and so I wanted to give a little bit of time to the work that I've done at University of Bologna during my PhD. And this was the title of my dissertation, Measure the Modeled Carbon Flows After Land Use Change to Perennial Bioenergy Crops. And so basically, we were studying these perennial crops for the production of bioenergy. So to increase, obviously, the use of renewable energy. For example, two crops that I studied were switchgrass and giant reed. You can see them in the picture there. That's switchgrass and that's giant reed. And obviously, scientists found that you know, the use of these crops can bring a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions through different, because of different things, correct? Because they can increase soil carbon inventories. These perennial crops, they really can develop like massive root systems that can contribute to soil carbon. And at the same time, being perennial, you don't till the soil as much. And at the same time, you can even gain, reduce greenhouse gas emissions more by offsetting the use of fossil fuel sources. And at the same time, these are also low input crops. So you save even more carbon by producing less inputs and using less inputs. So as I said, less tillage, less fertilization. Also, there are some constraints because when you try to produce these crops, you have to select a certain land, correct? So you have a land use change. So you can select marginal land that is not really occupied by anything, but you may anyway have some negative effects, for example, like, you know, reducing the biodiversity, for example. And there is this other factor that was described by some scientists that they call indirect land use change. And people hadn't thought about it before, and they say, okay, you are replacing corn with a perennial crop, and that's really good. You stop tilling the soil, you're increasing soil carbon, we have more energy, clean energy, so that's all great, but that corn that is not produced on the piece of land anymore is still maybe demanded in the market. And then someone is gonna convert the Amazon to produce that corn. So that made, you know, the situation even more complex, but that's a factor. Anyway, my research has focused on, you know, mostly, you know, look at the carbon budgets of these crops and soil organic carbon, and a little bit on, you know, estimating fossil fuel offsets, the carbon produced with the inputs, and also some coarse estimations of indirect land use change. So I'm gonna just show a little bit of a study that I've done that is basically comparison of annual crop versus perennial bioenergy crops. This is kind of a nostalgic picture. This is really like the first instrument that I started using during my PhD to measure soil respiration and soil temperature. And there I'm just collecting some soil cores on a young switchgrass at the beginning of the vegetative season. But so anyway, here you will say already, I'm trying to compare all the biomass carbon between the two systems. You can see for switchgrass, you have the establishment here, and then how the root biomass and the above ground biomass grow. And here you have like the above ground biomass and root biomass. You can see the big difference in root biomass between the two systems for a maize wheat rotation. I also looked at carbon dioxide fluxes. We had a eddy covariance tower in the switchgrass field, not in the other system, unfortunately, but for who doesn't know, the eddy covariance tower uses like vertical turbulent fluxes to measure the exchange of carbon or water between the ecosystem and the atmosphere. So some of the metrics that are calculated are the gross primary production of the ecosystem respiration, the net ecosystem exchange. Soil respiration was measured separately, not with the eddy covariance tower. So here what I did, I used the model called DACENT that simulates cycling of carbon and nitrogen in agricultural and natural systems. And basically I was calibrating the model and comparing the monthly fluxes either measured or modeled with the model. And then I validated the model also by comparing the simulated soil carbon storage versus the measured in the long term. For the maize wheat rotation, we had like long-term trials, like 40 years. For the switchgrass, it was like 10 to 14 years. And so when that was validated, I could run simulations. And basically here I'm comparing different like cropping systems. So the maize wheat rotation with different level of residue removal versus switchgrass, fertilized or unfertilized. And you can see switchgrass really, in the long term, at least we simulated that it could accumulate a lot of carbon in the soil. And then obviously it kind of like, reaches kind of a plateau after some time. But for the other annual crop rotation, when you don't have residue removal, you can gain a little bit of carbon. But otherwise, if you even remove the residues, you really end up losing carbon in the long. And anyway, my presentation is mostly going to be about the Everglades, so I wanted to give a brief talk about this, but I'm going to move to my work in South Florida and in the Everglades. And so I've been working with different like drivers of these ecosystems. Nobody would argue that definitely hydrology is one of that, correct? Most of the natural systems in South Florida, not all of them, but are wetlands. And so hydrology is an extremely important factor. And so we know that, water used to flow as sheet flow through the river of grass from Lake Okeechobee down to Florida Bay. But then because of human settlement and agricultural production, the system was compartmentalized. There's really a dense web of canals. And so water now gets concentrated in these canals, and that produced like some areas to be dehydrated, and also because of agricultural activity and the concentration of water in these canals, some eutrophication problems. I also looked at fire as an ecosystem driver, and I put here like this question, like, is Florida the lighting capital of the world? I checked the answer, and the answer is no. The lighting capital of the world is in Venezuela, but Florida is the lighting capital of the United States. And so this high frequency and density of lighting tells us, and we know that like historically fire would occur often and was a very big driver of ecosystem dynamics. And because of anthropogenic impacts, we've impacted the fire regimes because we built roads, we built canals, and so we created fire barriers. And so what Everglades National Park and a lot of other agencies in South Florida do, they use prescribed fire. to try to mimic the historical fire regimes, or any way to have fire regimes that are beneficial for these ecosystems and for habitats. And then another important, as I mentioned, driver in South Florida is nutrients, correct? Phosphorus especially. We have in the Everglades wetlands different vegetation communities that are basically they derive from really different hydrologic regimes. So we have drier areas, where you can have muley grass and marl prairies, and very wet areas where you have sloughs, correct? But also you get eutrophication impacts, and then you have these impacted marshes where you have a mix of sawgrass and cattle, or you may have just cattle. And so here, this is just a graph from this publication by Aggerday, where they show basically when you reach a certain threshold in eutrophication, here they're talking about concentrations in the soil, basically there's a regime shift, and vegetation shifts to a different set of species, and usually they're invasive species, right, like cattle. And so this is another factor that are, something that I've taken into consideration in my work. And so I want to present this study just because this is a study where I really taken into account all of these factors that I just talked about. So hydrology, fire, biogeochemistry, and vegetation community dynamics. And this study, basically, it's, this monitoring, is being carried out in Northeast Archivers, which is the northeast corner of Everglades National Park, because that was the area where rehydration initiated for Everglades National Park. And so, as you can see, rehydration of that area was planned within the Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Plan and began in October 2015. And so this area has been monitored for many years. So you can see here a couple of pictures of myself sampling there. And I felt a little bit bad about these pictures because I only put myself, but that's what I could gather while I was putting together a presentation. What I mean to say is that, when I was working with John, I participated in the sampling a couple of years, 2019, 2020. What I want to say, you see me here, and actually there's a lot of people that collected this data. One of them is Chris over there. He's done a lot of work, and probably there's others in this room. But here I am in the picture with the quadrant in front and counting vegetation. So for this analysis, we used 65 sites out of the 80 sites that are actually part of the monitoring that were consistently sampled in 2015, 2018, and 2021. We collected carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus concentrations of surface water, periphyton, flocculent detrital material, known as floc, and soil. And we also collected information on macrophyte plant species composition and density. So these are some of the results for hydrology, and you can see monthly mean water depth across the 65 sites that I mentioned really bumped up after 2015. It's pretty evident. So we saw that mean hydro period went up from 292 days to 344, which is substantial. Also, mean days since dry down also almost doubled. The mean duration of dry down events decreased by 61%, and mean water depth across the 65 sites increased from 45 to 55 centimeters, like a threefold increase, which was really, really big. As I said, so here are the 65 sites. They're colored differently because we basically grouped them into 4 groups. For the grouping, we used a non-metric multidimensional scaling ordination technique, where basically we used carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus concentrations in the periphyton, floc, and soil to basically characterize each site in terms of biogeochemistry. So by characterizing it, basically we could see which sites would group together, and so basically which sites were similar in terms of biogeochemical characteristics. And we identified these 4 groups. So you can see that the Chem1 and Chem2 groups were really in proximity of the L29 canal, which is the canal where the water was inflowing from, while the other 2 groups, Chem2 and Chem3 and Chem4, were actually farther away from the canal, especially Chem4, like 12 kilometers on average. We also looked at fire. You can see here we considered both wildfires and prescribed fires, and basically for each site and then for each group, we calculated the mean time since last fire. So here I'm showing how the results on the changes in floc and soil total phosphorus concentrations. And so you can see how these remain stable at the sites in proximity of the canal, but they actually decreased at sites further away from the canal. The decrease in soil phosphorus also resulted in increased soil carbon to phosphorus and nitrogen to phosphorus ratios. So this plot is describing vegetation dynamics. So we used again the NMDS ordination to describe this vegetation community dynamics. So here in this plot, you can see how each of the 4 groups, how vegetation shifted from 2015, 2018 to 2021. And we used the importance values of 18 macrophyte species, who were the ones that were most present in the area. And the importance values, they really come from relative density, relative biomass, and relative frequency of the species. And so basically we observed that, vegetation of basically 3 groups shifted in the direction of increasing hydro period. But the vegetation of 1 group of sites that were in proximity of the canal shifted in the direction of decreasing nitrogen to phosphorus ratios and decreasing time since last fire. So it means that these sites were burned in the previous years, correct? They received fire. This is like gives you a more detailed view on the 18 species that we looked at and how they change across the whole region, irrespective of the group, in 6 years. So you can see all these like species that have small, they had like they were not very abundant, but they were still very present in 2015 before rehydration. They started like disappearing, and these are like the short hydroperiod species. Then intermediate hydroperiod species like Rhynchospora, they initially shifted away from the canal because the areas in proximity of the canal, the ones that were more affected by rehydration initially, but then eventually as the area was getting more rehydrated, they really substantially reduced. On the opposite, the long hydroperiod species like sawgrass, spikerush, and cattle as well, unfortunately, they increased. Especially spikerush that really likes deep water expanded sites further away from the canal inflow. And this is another result that we had. We basically ran this indicator species analysis where basically we we tried to see if there were species significantly associated with certain conditions. So for example, we found several species associated with the short hydro period, which were disappearing from the area, or typha being associated or Iliacoros with intermediate or long hydro period. And we also found species associated with high phosphorus concentrations in the soil. And not surprisingly, we have Sagittaria, but we have obviously typha, correct? While Iliacoros or Rhynchospora were associated with low to medium phosphorus, but never with high phosphorus. And some observations from the study, so we saw that these changes in water deliveries expanded the proportion of the landscape experiencing high water depths and long hydro periods. Also, the increase in carbon to phosphorus and nitrogen to phosphorus ratios, together with the decrease in soil phosphorus, we think it may indicate reinitiation of peat accretion in the areas farther away from the canal. Let's remember, those were the areas that were initially more degraded, more dehydrated. After 6 years of hydrologic restoration, apart from the areas in proximity of the inflow points, where basically we noticed that there was an interaction between fire occurrence and the pre-existing degraded conditions that favored the expansion of cattle, invasive vegetation. But in general, we saw that the native long hydroperiod species expanded and replaced short and intermediate hydroperiod species. And the other important thing is that, I didn't show here, but we saw that some of the water deliveries in several instances, they had phosphorus concentrations in the water that was above the limit established to prevent eutrophication. However, the natural landscape demonstrated great assimilation capacity and resiliency by showing reduced rather than increased eutrophic conditions and expansion of native hydric communities in most of the region. So that was really a great result. I'm gonna get a sip of water in a second. So, and this is a conceptual figure that we created. We're basically showing just that in Northeast River Zoo, but in general, in healthy restored ecotrophic peat wetlands, we want hydroperiod above a certain threshold and phosphorus below a certain threshold, right? And this is just a couple of pictures showing the area just below of the Tamiami Trail bridge before rehydration and after rehydration. Now, the next thing that I want to talk about, still because this is another project where I kind of use the holistic approach, correct? I'm really taking into account a lot of different factors, is the bioenergy model that I was asked to work on when I was working at Everglades National Park. So I worked on this model that will help the fire managers to understand how to prioritize prescribed fire in the park. So we can see that Everglades National Park is a large and heterogeneous landscape, and it includes multiple ecosystem types and habitats of endangered species. So all these things needs to be taken into account when you burn, correct? And also, at the same time, fire managers, they need to protect infrastructure. They need to protect cultural and recreational resources, be mindful of peoples and people activity. And they have, no matter what, they have limited resources. So they need to use them efficiently while achieving all of these goals. And so that's why we worked on this model that would kind of automate their process and help them supporting their process in their decision-making process. So this is the full list of criteria that I used in the model. So we have obviously time since last fire was the most important factor. The wild-urban interface, or WUI, which basically considers all those areas that are around either infrastructure or cultural, archaeological resources, or recreational resources like trails or campgrounds, for example. The protection of endangered fauna species was very important. So we fire needs to be used in order to protect the habitats of these species, especially some species that are really dependent on fire, like the Cape Sable seaside sparrow. Some of the endangered butterflies in the pine rocklands, the Florida bonneted bat, black rail, and snailkite. Then fire needs to be used also to control invasive species. We also took into account hydrologic conditions because we really needed to prioritize drier areas, because in those areas, wildfires, they can be bigger and more catastrophic. So fire managers really care about keeping fuel loads low in those areas. This criterion generated from the fact that we found out that areas that are characterized by more oligotrophic conditions, they really rely on fire for recycling nutrients to the soil and back to the vegetation. And then we used a couple of more logistical criteria that were important for fire managers. So the size of the burn unit and the ease of burning, how complex it is to burn a certain burn unit, was also taken into account. And here you can see like a snippet of the table, but basically what I want to show is that all these criteria were assigned a maximum score that they could produce in each pixel of the map. But really, some of those were dependent on time since last fire. For example, for the different ecotypes, or for the protection of specific the habitat of specific species. So you can see easily here, for example, time since last fire is 1, they're actually getting a negative score because you don't want to burn too early. It's going to be actually damaging the sparrow. And then as time since last fire grows, then this becomes more influential, correct? After 8 years, they get the whole 8 points. Same for pine rocklands, after 7 years, they get the all 30 points for time since last fire. That means, okay, you're late, at this point you need to burn. And so this was pretty much, but then there were other criteria where it was just a yes or no. Is it a buoy or is not? So if it is, it's getting the points. If it's not, it doesn't. So not all of those were dependent on time since last fire. So here is just, I'm showing like the time since last fire map for the year 2023 at the beginning of the simulations that we've run. And obviously, as I said, time since last fire was the driving criterion for this model. You can see here that time since last fire in reality obviously originates from both prescribed fires and wildfires. And you can see that there's heterogeneity within, especially within large burn units. Now, this is a limitation of the model, correct? As we're trying to simulate future fire management, you can only simulate certain burn units fires, but you don't really, at least I didn't have the ability to simulate wildfire. And so this difference between this map that is taking into account wildfires with the maps that I generated after 50 years of simulations is that you lose this heterogeneity within burn units. This is like the model. It was built in ArcGIS with the ArcMap model builder. And so I just want to give a brief look at how it works. Basically, you have these blue circles. They are the spatial layers used as inputs. And then the yellow boxes, they show the geoprocessing tools. We use the extract by mask and reclassify to calculate criterion-specific scores. And then you have the green circles, boxes that indicate the outputs. And then so we use the raster calculator after to basically calculate a final score for each pixel of the map that would take into account all the criterion-specific scores and basically sum them up, add them up. And so these are basically the outputs, still for the same year, 2023. And so we have a map that has the output, the prioritization scores at the pixel scale, and a map that has the scores at the burn unit scale. So the score is just average across the unit. And so, and these scores were used to prioritize. So the next thing that we've done was to actually run simulations for 50 years. So every year we will run the model, we will get the simulate, we will get the priorities, and we will use like a threshold in terms of how much surface we could burn, because obviously there's limited resources. So we wanted to take into account. And so based on those burns, we will rerun the model the next year and calculate new priorities and burn again. So after 50 years of that, we could actually calculate fire return intervals for the conservation objectives. So basically what we did here, we compared for the different habitats and the different ecotypes, what, based on the literature and other documents, what's the target fire return interval, and what is the one that we simulated by using the model. So we basically were able to verify that the model was parameterized in a way that it was really able to efficiently produce these fire return intervals that would be able to help fire managers to preserve these habitats and ecotypes. And so exactly, so this is what I put in observations. Now, the model was calibrated in a way that would allow achievement of the conservation goals. So, and while fire return intervals calculated from the simulations correlated with the conservation targets, by baseline fire return intervals did not. So it was a demonstration that to a certain extent, at least, the model would help fire manager to have a more efficient process. Also, we noticed that Everglades National Park has large burn units, and these are large just because there's low density of fire barriers in certain areas, especially. There are no roads, and that's important because you don't want to compromise hydrology too much. And at the same time, you create these very large burn units where there's heterogeneity. And so where some reviewers were reviewing this manuscript, they're saying, oh, you didn't do a good job in creating the burn units. They're too big. And so my answer will be, well, we really can't. But anyway, that's something that, you know, working with this, we realized then in talking with the fire managers, really. And then, like, you know, as I was mentioning, if you want to work with the model for long-term fire management, there's limitations because, you know, it's really hard to simulate wildfires occurrence. And at the same time, this model doesn't take into account the patchiness of fires, which is a very important attribute, and it's a very desired attribute. Okay, now for the end of my presentation, I wanted to talk a little bit with my my work currently with the Seminole Tribe of Florida. I've worked with the tribe for a year and a half, and I work with the water quality team. So we do water quality monitoring mostly. I've been doing, and so this is a map of the biggest reservation of the Seminole Tribe. They have 7 reservations across Florida. This is Big Cypress, just north of the Big Cypress National Preserve. Some of the environments, the natural environments, they really resemble Big Cypress. These pictures was taken in this area. And so, but what you can see, besides, apart from this reservation, that we really sample water in a variety of environments and different really land uses and water body types. So we sample like sloughs, we sample wetlands, we sample like agricultural ditches, we sample community ponds, and also this is like the water coming from the C-139 annex, which is right here. So that's the dirty water coming from Sugarland. But anyway, just as I mentioned in my flyer, that really water flows through the land through different areas of the landscape, and it really registers not only the history, but also the current uses of the landscape. So it can really give you a lot of insight. And it is multidimensional because there's so many constituents that, they can change for a lot of different reasons. So it's important to monitor all of this. And for example, like, some months ago, we were up in Central Florida visiting Buck Island Ranch. And they were telling us that in terms of like legacy phosphorus, they estimated they stopped applying phosphorus in a certain patch of their pastures. And they were telling us that they calculated that to get rid of the legacy phosphorus, it would take them about 50 years. So even after completing stopping fertilization.
The Archbold, right? Archbold.
It's nearby Archbold. It's not inside Archbold, but it's nearby, yeah. So one of the things that I've done in the last year is really like data management. I'm the person that curates the databases for the water quality group. So we have pretty big data sets. Like we have a water quality with like about 95,000 observations from like over 300 monitoring sites with over 200 unique analytes. Now, routinely, we probably monitor just about 10 or 20 that we do routinely every month. But then once in a while, we'll do 80. Somehow, over 200 ended up in this data set. Don't ask me why, I don't know. But anyway, it's a lot. And we monitor water stage. We have over 2 million observations because these are continuous hourly data from 33 monitoring sites. And in the last 2 summers, we put together like an algae database because we've sampled water during algal blooms event. And so at least the lab that is analyzing that, they told us that we have a pretty rich samples, just in a couple of season sampling, where our database includes about 500 algae species. So they were pretty rich, pretty diverse, at least according to the lab. And so this is one of the things that I wanted to show. And as I said, we monitor water quality every month. And really, this was something that my colleague introduced. He's a statistician. He's really brilliant. And he basically introduced the bootstrapping procedure for anomaly detection that we use basically constantly now. And basically the reasoning for that, according to him, is that, and rightly so, I believe, all these analytes that we measure every month, they may have very different distributions. And also, we may be dealing with uneven or data sets with gaps that are really, really difficult to represent with parametric distributions. And so that's why we started using this bootstrap, that basically what it does, you take the data set and what he was saying is that they understood historically that this technique could be very efficient. It's just that like decades ago, it was really hard because we didn't have the computational ability to really apply it. So parametric statistics were very useful when we would do things by hand, pretty much. And so, but he's saying that now that we should use this type of techniques. And basically, what the bootstrap does, he repeatedly resample the same data set. We do it 10,000 times, and basically from that specific data set, we get a median and the 90% confidence interval. And we compare that with the current month's data. And so we're able basically to detect anomalies. And so as you can see here this is like one of the pages of our monthly report, you can see when we have anomalies in phosphorus concentrations. And regardless, so this different coloring, we implemented this other thing where we include the protection standard. So that means of the whole distribution, whatever is green is below the protection standard, whatever is orange is above the protection standard. That tells you that this location, 75% of the time is above the protection standard. And this month was anomalously high. Now, the nitrogen is never above, and it was within the confidence interval, for example. So it's a pretty cool technique, and we think it's very useful. And then the other thing that I wanted to talk about, and this is a process that we just started, so we're working on. We're doing this triennial review of the water quality standards for the Seminole tribe. And so the tribe has a sovereignty. I don't know how to pronounce that word, I'm sorry, but and they can set their own standards for water quality. And so this is a really exciting opportunity for us, really. And basically, I just want to show a little bit of the complexity, and we'll have to do this work in a year, but basically, we're gonna have these standards that we'll set. They will have to be reviewed through public hearings by, you know, the Water Commission of the Seminole Tribe, Tribal Council, and once they will be approved by these by the government, basically they will be effective within the reservations. At the same time, they won't be effective outside the reservation. So we couldn't keep any upstream user up to them until they're actually approved by EPA and they become part of the Clean Water Act. And so in this process, what we'll do, there's 2 steps to this process where we need to classify each water body in each reservation and really set the standard for each of these classes. Because, you know, one of the things that is that, you know, that it's mandatory for EPA, you not only need to set these standards that make sense, you need to demonstrate that these are achievable. And so that's why we're gonna have different classes where, you know, you don't wanna set very restrictive standards when you know you can't achieve them. Let's say, you know, you don't wanna put a 10 part per billion standard for phosphorus in agricultural ditches. And so these are like the classes that we currently have. And so we have 3 classes and 3 subclasses. And so as you can see, like, you know, the class 2 will be the one that is more protective of ecosystems. And then you have water used for agricultural purposes and the potable water for the community. And then you have these subclasses where you can basically use some of those for what we call them mixing zones. So you don't want to flow water from agriculture directly in a wetland. So you want to use some water bodies as mixing zones where they have like an intermediate protection standard, and you clean the water through those, correct? And this is like a screenshot from the tables that is present now in the official documents of the tribe. And basically, we don't have a standard for nutrients. It's really, I agree 100%. And here it says, in no case shall nutrient concentrations of a body of water be altered so as to cause an imbalance in natural populations of aquatic flora or fauna. But also that can become extremely subjective. So we're protecting, but we're not protecting at the same time. And so I think it's very important to set, you know, our objective would be to set actual numeric criteria for nutrients for these classes. And here I just want to show, like, you know, the different reservations. This is not really a reservation, but we have, there's camps. Anyway, you know, the Seminole Tribe of Florida is present, is very present in South Florida. And so, you know, we feel that setting nutrient criteria, especially for phosphorus for the Seminole Tribe, really may have a substantial impact on both Everglades and Big Cypress restoration processes. And so we're pretty excited and we feel the importance of this. So, and with that, thank you for attending.
Thank you, Dr. Nocentini.